Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first episode of the Foot and Ankle Clinics podcast. I'm Megan Ashdown, the managing editor for the series here at Elsevier. Foot and Ankle Clinics is a quarterly publication with each issue focusing on a single topic in foot and ankle surgery. Today, we will be interviewing our founding consulting editor, Dr. Mark S. Myerson, one of the world's foremost experts on foot and ankle reconstruction and injury since 1995. Here now is the new consulting editor for the series, Dr. Cesar de Cesar Neto, to lead the discussion, along with Drs. Mark Easley and Federico Uzueli.
This is outstanding that we have all these important people with us here today. This will be the first podcast for Foot and Ankle Clinics with Elsevier, and we're very excited to have our first guest that couldn't be anyone else, the myth, the legend, Mark Myerson, that was the editor-in-chief for Foot and Ankle Clinics for 25 years. And was kind enough to offer me the position once he decided it was time for him to do something else, because he never stops, as we all know. And so I'm happy to have Dr. Myerson here, and I'll give him to say hi. But before, I want to thank Dr. Mark Easley and Dr. Federico Uzueli, that were both Mark Myerson's fellows in the past. Dr. Easley, I think before Federico's, and Federico's is in Italy and it was an international fellow with Dr. Myerson. I haven't had the pleasure to train with Dr. Myerson, unfortunately, but he has been a life and career mentor for me since we first met in Baltimore back in 2014. So we all have in common here Dr. Myerson kind of touching our lives and bringing us up and pushing us up to do cool stuff. So Dr. Myerson, thanks for being here. Dr. Easley and Dr. Uzueli, great to have you guys. Dr. Myerson, do you want to say hi before we start shooting questions on you?
Oh, no, go ahead. That's fine. I'm with friends, and so I'm ready. Let's do it. It's all spontaneous, so whatever you want.
Yeah, Dr. Easley, did you see? So we have a list here that we don't have to follow, but I always wanted to know from Dr. Myerson, how did it go? We know that he's from South Africa originally, and how was that? How was the family decision making? How did he end up in the U.S.? So if you could tell a little bit for us about how was your life in South Africa and how did you end up coming to the United States, Dr. Myerson?
So it was quite curious because I decided to leave in 1978 and finally arrived here in the end of 79. And the reason for my coming here had nothing to do with orthopedic surgery. I actually came here to do plastic surgery to the US. And one thing led to another. I started out as I'd already done my internship in South Africa, in fact, 2 years. And then here, one thing led to another, and orthopedics suddenly opened up, and there I was. So I stayed. I mean, there were obviously family, political, and many other factors that motivated me to come to the US in way back then. Yeah.
Dr. Easley, Federico, feel free to jump in and ask specific questions. We're trying to follow here like a flow.
Question from personal life. So I've been with you in Baltimore. So I'm asking you why you decided to stay in Baltimore. Why this was your first city in US and maybe your more important city in your life. Why you decided to stay in Baltimore?
Yeah. You know, as I think back, if I were to be able to do it all over again, I would probably choose Baltimore all over again because the city was very good to me and my career was wonderful. But how I ended up in Baltimore was purely a coincidence, because I was visiting friends from Cape Town. And one day they said to me, "Oh, listen, just around the corner from us, there's a local hospital and the chairman of surgery is from Cape Town. And you should go and say hello to him," which I did. And he convinced me to stay. And I never left. So it wasn't even, in a way, the decision had been made for me. I really believe that we don't necessarily choose a place, a career. It chooses us. It's the same reason why I ended up in foot and ankle. Yes, to some extent I chose it, but I really believe that it was there. It chose me.
It's not the wizard that chooses the wand, it's the wand that chooses the wizard. Isn't that what Harry Potter movie says?
Thank you. You're quite right.
Yeah. So, and how was, going back a little bit, Dr. Myerson, I would like to know about your NYU fellowship with Dr. Jazz. That is usually something that people say was a unique experience.
Yeah,
I would love to hear from your point of view.
It was amazing. I will tell you that I wasn't a particularly motivated orthopedic resident. I had a lot going on in my life, 2 young children, and I was very interested in ceramics. I had a ceramic studio, and I've been doing pottery ever since then. And I was running marathons at the time. So all my spare time wasn't directed to orthopedics. But when I got to New York to do my fellowship, everything changed. All of a sudden, I had a focus. I was really motivated to learn from him. And he was a unique individual. This man knew the literature. It was phenomenal. And his knowledge of the literature was not contemporary, because he used to say to me always, "Well, you know nothing until you've read the international foreign literature in their language." And he used to talk about the Italian orthopedic literature and the German orthopedic literature a lot. We used to sit at many meetings together, and a paper would be presented, and he would turn to me and he'd say, "That person knows nothing about what he's talking about. And here he's presenting it as if this is a new idea. And he's just not read the literature, because this was presented in 1929 by so-and-so." He was also a very, very cynical man. He really did not believe anything that was written. And he was the editor of Foot and Ankle in those days. In those days, it wasn't Foot and Ankle International, it was called Foot and Ankle. And he never believed anything. And he always taught me, do not believe what you read until you do it yourself, and make sure that it works for you before accepting everything as gospel. He was a very kind man. You have to put it in the context of 1983 and the types of fixation. I remember doing an ankle fusion with him when screws were used for the very first time. Screws had not been used in ankle fusions up until then. This was, a momentous event. And he also gave me 3 months to spend in the lab to do some research, which I thought was really useful, because I did some cadaveric work, and all of a sudden I was immersed in foot and ankle, wanting to be productive, wanting to do more research. And that kind of just catapulted me that year with him.
I have a question for you. What is nowadays your attitude towards literature? Do you believe in literature or not nowadays?
Oh, very much so. So I think that the way I would answer it is with a healthy amount of skepticism. I'm not cynical as Professor Joss was, but when I read something, it's not often that we get the privilege of reading something that's really new, that's creative, that's innovative, that you say, wow, why didn't I think of that? That's really important. Why didn't I think of that? I love reading the literature. In fact, here I've just got my journal, my foot and ankle clinics just came in, and I can't wait to read it. I love keeping up. I love maintaining my knowledge. There's always something to learn, but the problem is that we'll read something on hallux valgus, we'll read something on ankle arthritis, and it's very similar. There's not terribly much that's new. It's my series of 100 cases, my series of 50 cases, my meta-analysis. And I would really like to see a little more creativity, a little more innovation. This podcast, for example, is wonderful. It's a new trend. I can tell you that as far as the literature is concerned, this is where foot and ankle clinics really makes a difference. It really does, because it's contemporary information that's summarized for the reader. And that really does make a difference. It's exciting to read. And since Cesar has taken over the helm of the senior editor, I really have already seen a trend where he's headed, and I'm very excited. I look forward to the next few years and more to see what he does with the journal, because you have a lot more potential in a journal like that to actually control the thinking and the information that's passed on from year to year with surgeons who don't necessarily have access to this type of information in a contemporary way.
So, Mark, is it more about good data or expert opinion, or a balance of them?
Neither. When it comes to data, numbers, I've got 74 cases of this, and you look at the table and look at the data. Data is not that impressive. Data is not that important. Expert opinion, I really do believe in. I really think that we've got a lot to learn from expert opinion. It's downplayed. Over the past 10 years, outcomes, level 1, 2, 3 studies have been given a lot of focus and less emphasis on expert opinion. And I think that's a pity. This is where foot and ankle clinics really can make an impact, because it's the opinion of one person synthesizing the information that he or she wants to present. And that's very, very important. I'd also like to see new ideas. There are journals that give you the opportunity to read stuff that is not dependent on a big series of cases. New, innovative, creative techniques. It's very, very important that we as surgeons have access to this, to learn new things that is not, I know that maybe a level 2, 3 outcome study has relevance, but it may not really have any relevance to the surgeon who's trying to learn something.
So Mark, you've published more than just about anybody in foot and ankle, in the foot and ankle world. How did you gather your ideas? How did you make a decision? Where was that decision made? This is worth studying. Was it just because you had a big volume practice and you could do many things, or was it something that you felt was important and needed to be answered? Where did you get your ideas?
That's a great question, Mark. I'll give you just one little example. I was up all of last night. I told Cesar this earlier. I pulled what we used to call an all-nighter. I had a deadline to meet. I was months late, and I had relied on a team member to get this to me and me to do the editing. I had to start all again. The topic was on flat foot, what we now know as PCFD. And one of the requests by the editor was to summarize my contribution to the literature to PCFD. And I thought about it and I said, wow, as I was going through stuff that I really did contribute, and I made a difference, made an impact in our decision-making and how we approach things, it became quite meaningful to me. There were many, many papers that I've written on various aspects of PCFD, culminating in the consensus group that Cesar was part of, and hopefully you will be able to contribute to in the near future. It's I was very proud to see these events in the history of flatfoot that I've been able to contribute to. But now back to your question. I think that you all know, the three of you know me as very spontaneous, a little impulsive, but I've always wanted to try something new. Always. If I see something done one way, I've always wondered, well, why do it that way? Maybe I can do this better. Mark, you will remember actually when you were a fellow and Hans Trinker was with us, we were doing an osteotomy of the fifth metatarsal. And I said, wait a minute, we can do that same osteotomy on the first metatarsal. And I knew that osteotomy had never been described before. So I asked you to look it up, and you came back and said, no, never been published. And Hans went back to the German literature again, and he came back and said, I found this paper written, and it's called Ludloff. But all Ludloff did was to cut the first metatarsal obliquely, and that was it. There was no technique to it. There was no fixation, nothing. It was just an oblique cut, and he was done. So that came about, and of course, there are many of us who are still using the Ludloff osteotomy, and successfully. I love thinking that there are other ways to do things. And then all of a sudden, as I'm doing them, I discover that, well, maybe it's not so good this way. I should try it another way. I've had many things that I've done, many ideas that have totally failed. I started in the 1990s when I saw that distraction ankle arthroplasty, which had come out of Holland, was becoming popular. I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a try. And in those days, I was using a uniplanar external fixator, and the results weren't great in my hands at all. So I thought, well, either I'm doing this incorrectly, I'm not adhering to the principles of distraction and intermittent compression of the joint. I'm going to try it differently. So I started this prospective study on interposition arthroplasty of the ankle. And I took fascia lata grafts and I distracted the ankle. I put a fascia lata graft in, and well, needless to say, they all failed. And it when you're involved in something like that, it takes a little while for you to realize that they're not doing that well, whether it's 6 months, 9 months, or a year. And so it wasn't long before I abandoned this. And then about 8 years later, a patient came to see me and said, "Hello, Dr. Myerson, do you remember me?" I said, "No, I'm really sorry, I don't." He said, "Well, you operated on my ankle 9 years ago, and you told me it was experimental, that you'd never done this before, but you wanted to try something, and you explained it to me, and I thought, okay." And it was fantastic for 9 years. And I realized that he was the only one with interposition arthroplasty that actually really did well over the long term. I think that we as surgeons are, we really are divided into those who, like the three of you are always prepared to take on something differently, to try it differently, to be creative, to work out of your comfort zone, to step out of that little tight circle and to forget your GPS. That's something that fellows need to understand. They've been trained as residents, and they've been trained to think a certain way and do things a certain way. And perhaps that's important. And then they come into fellowship, and again, they seeing things done perhaps by recipe. But what I try to get them to understand is that they need to lose this GPS. They've got to venture out and get lost. Really, not, of course, at the patient's expense, but at least so that they're struggling a little bit to find an alternative way of doing things. That kind of creativity and being out of your comfort zone, I think, is what really helped me and energized me to find new ideas, new techniques, trying things differently. And this has been consistent throughout my career because I'm still looking for that. We have currently 27 research projects underway. And these are all, pretty cool stuff. New ideas, which is nice.
Mark,
yeah.
In Italy, we say, il meglio è nemico del bene. That means the better. I don't know how to translate in a good way in English, but it means that to try better sometimes it's enemy of the good things. So do you think that this is a principle for people that has not the courage to try something more, or do you think that should be a limitation that we need to deal with while we are doing our practice? So what is your attitude towards this principle, il meglio è nemico del bene?
So you translated it fairly well. The enemy of good is better. And you have to know your own limits. Because in many cases, for many surgeons, they're better off knowing their limits, understanding them, and staying within that comfort zone. I don't believe that the three of you would be where you are today if you did not work many times out of your comfort zone, trying to do things better, okay, and differently. And it's that I don't think that saying holds true for a group of educators, leaders, thinkers. You have to, in order to advance, you have to think out of the box.
We'll take a quick pause here to let our listeners know that they can receive an exclusive discount on an issue of their choosing by visiting us.elsevierhealth.com/expert.
So there's no one as present as Dr. Myerson, at least in the foot and ankle world. I would say that I've been around, and even for other specialties, I don't know anyone else that is that respected or well known, at least internationally. So it's not that he's just super respected in the U.S. And he pretty much have interacted with every single person that I know. And that's crazy. That's like, and that was before the internet era, Dr. Myers. So we cannot blame on internet. So the question for you goes, and I think a lot of the researchers, I have fellows here, international fellows, I think they bring so much ideas and so much feedback. And I think you were a visionary of starting this relationship in the past and opening doors for Americans and international people at the same time. So I would like to understand, how did you start that? Because like Federico mentioned, that you were in Baltimore, that is like, let's say, a small town. MedStar and Mercy are not like, it's easy to be a Duke and, be Dr. Mark easily. The problem is like, how did you do that in Baltimore in two, let's say, private scenarios?
Yeah.
So teach us a little bit about that, because it's important for all of us.
Sure. So as you all know, I came out of private practice. I was in two private institutions, one for 18, 20 years and another one for 15 years. And in many instances, you're quite right. You don't have the backing of a university or the credibility of a university to do what I did. But what happened was that in the late 1980s, I was really fortunate to already, as a young foot and ankle surgeon, be embraced by the leaders at the time. I really was very fortunate, and be befriended by those leaders. They were Mike Coughlin, Roger Mann, Bill Hamilton, James Samarco, and others. And I was very, very motivated early on to push myself and to be able to find ways for me to learn and disseminate my knowledge. To some extent, I think that a lot of that had to do with me being an immigrant to the US. Because I had this constant feeling that I needed to give back, and I wanted other people to have a similar opportunity that I had. And starting in 1990 I already started the fellowship in 1987, but by 1990, I had made a decision to open that experience not just to US fellows, but to accept international fellows. And this just took off. My first international fellow was Terry Saxby from Brisbane, Australia in 1990. And one of the things that I'm really proud of is that many of these, if not most of these international fellows, became leaders in their own country. And that network began to expand. You must realize that in the early 1990s, the foot and ankle brotherhood was very small. To be invited to go to meetings internationally was not that common back then. But as more and more individuals visited with me and studied with me, this whole network became bigger and bigger, to the point that I realized that international education was much more relevant in educating the US surgeons. Because remember, in the early 1990s, there were only 3 fellowships available: Melvin Jas, Kenneth Johnson, and Roger Mann. That was it. How many do we have available today? 56 fellowship locations available to 77 fellows annually, and that number may have even have gone up. We didn't have that in those days. And so what had become necessary 2 decades later was to say, Nah. It's much more important to make this education available to international surgeons, because there was no other opportunity in the US for international surgeons at that time. Subsequently, others have made themselves available to visitors, but to be able to do a hands-on fellowship, I thought was very important. In fact, in 2000, I started a nonprofit foundation specifically to educate international surgeons. And that led over the next 2 decades to where we are today, where 6 years ago, I left hospital practice to start another nonprofit humanitarian organization called Steps to Walk. And we have a global presence that is absolutely phenomenal. I probably could not have accomplished this without the input, guidance, and support of all of my past fellows. But having that network in so many different countries really did facilitate this. And it was a very important period to think about. Now, Cesar, you accept international fellows, as do you, Mark, and you, Federico, as well. And you recognize how important it is, but put yourself back 30 years. It wasn't available. When Mark was a fellow with me, he interacted with a lot of international fellows, some whom he had known, some who there's an opportunity to learn from others. You cannot possibly be an educator unless you're prepared to learn from your students, fellows in this case. There's always something that you're going to learn from them. But there's another aspect to it, and that's the social aspect, the bonding, the friendships that are formed. And these international friendships were really substantial and have continued to be so.
Oh, that's the link. That's the link for Dr. Easley. So you want to tell us about Dr. Mark Myerson as your mentor and as your fellowship director. How was that interaction? Tell us a little bit about how he was able to mold your life and your career into what you are right now. That is also like a huge leader nationally and internationally.
Before Mark starts, there's just a limited amount of molding that I, as his mentor, could do. He was the one, just like the wand and the wizard, he was the one to take, and right at the very beginning, look, I can look back over the past 35 years and I can name you the fellows, 1, 2 hands, who I knew as they started that they were going to be successful. And Mark was one of them. So, I had a part in it, but Mark was the individual to carry it forward. Okay, Mark, I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
How was the fellowship? You want to know? That was tiring. That's what it was. Mark Myerson's a very difficult person to keep pace with, right? I mean, I had to work hard. I remember times I'd finish an OR day and I'd have to just sit down when nobody was looking in the hallway and just collapse. And Mark would just keep going because it'd be a full day in surgery, a full day in clinic, very organized, but very driven, right? And then after that, there'd be research time after that, or discussion time, or wheels always turning. So it was, for me, it's just like you, Mark, you said you had great mentors. Well, you could identify that in me. Without you, that would have never happened. It just would not have, because you set a standard that's impossible to follow, but it certainly motivated me because it excited me, right? And it's continued to make my career so much more exciting. But it's motivation. You showed me the way of how to do it. I could never match what you do, but it certainly motivated me to keep me going. And I do appreciate your ability to interact with so many different and influence so many foot and ankle surgeons and start their careers or further their experiences And for me, that was always exciting. And I wanted to at least have a small part of that. So I've been fortunate under your guidance to be able to do that.
Mark, you know, I will tell everybody, and this applies to each one of you here, that I was fortunate to have you in my life. You know, when you start out as a fellow, there's a fellow mentor relationship, and you can't really bridge that gap initially. But I will give you a very good example with Federico. What happens is that very soon, while you may continue that role as a mentor and be there as an advisor and a guide, a friendship develops. I'm proud to tell you that I was Federico and Camila's best man at their wedding. There's a beautiful relationship that develops with each and every one of you. Yeah. And I benefited from that.
But that's really important, because there was a while I didn't talk to Mark after I was in practice. I was busy with family doing things, and I received a phone call from Mark. So I picked up, I said, hi. And I was with my kids doing something. And I said, what's going on? He said, nothing. I'm just calling you because I'm your friend. And, but I mean, that's amazing, right? Because we get so wrapped up. But to Mark, it reminded me of the importance of that, right? So it's not just thinking about foot and ankle, and it's not just thinking about what the next research project is or what the creative idea is. It's maintaining those relationships and how important that is. So that really made a big impression.
I couldn't agree more. You know, I remember, Mark, I don't know how many years ago, but you brought some of your kids to ski with me, and we stayed together, and it was pretty special. And now, many years later, you know, I love to hear about your children, what they're doing, where are they in their lives.
Well, I'll tell you where they are. They wish you would have been their dad. I should have never brought them there. They loved you more than me.
No, that's not true.
But you say that, but you take the extra time too, right? You'll choose a group of surgeons that you think would interact well and have an opportunity to exchange ideas well, and you'll be very generous. You'll open your door. You'll open your, but it's never idle, right? So it's fun.
No, never.
But I'm also learning about, not just learning about foot and ankle. I'm learning about wines. I'm learning about cooking. And even though you tortured us with being, working in your garden as fellows, I actually learned something about gardening. And had I been there at the right time, I'd probably be pretty good at pottery by now.
I knew that was coming.
But the passion is what I love about it. You put the thing you taught me more than anything is passion for everything that you do. So, you don't choose just anything. It's something that has meaning to you, but then you are 100% passionate about it.
But that I've been very fortunate, and in that regard, I really feel blessed to have had people like you in my life, and blessed by opportunity in this country, and to be able to take advantage of that. I was saying earlier that it may not seem like it right now, but I'm a little tired. I only had 2 hours of sleep last night. I had a deadline for writing something, and I said, okay, I just got to get it done and suck it up. And I did that. And this morning, I take the fellows to an anatomy lab every Monday morning, and we work in the lab, trying out new procedures and looking at different things. And I've got a conference for the fellows and faculty this evening, which I'm looking forward to. And then tomorrow, the fellows and guests, visitors come to my home, and I cook for them. And we have what's called a dinner lecture. And many of my past fellows will actually remember that there was a time when, in addition to the dinner lecture, that was preceded by an hour of yoga. And that was compulsory. That was not optional. So
you have to enjoy the whole thing. There's no option up.
All right. So I have a question for you. I want to know. So it is amazing to the respect you show, right, for other for being invited to speak, particularly internationally. But let's think about it. You've learned Italian. And Federico, how is his Italian? We want to hear. Is it good?
Very good, very good.
Very good. Okay, very good. Okay. And then he's learned Spanish, so it's amazing. And then you said you never could do it, but you mastered Mandarin too. Is that right?
I've not mastered it, but most definitely I've been fortunate enough to have time to learn the language. It's there. You know, I think that it's, but that's just a love of communicating and a desire.
But that's a show of respect. You know, it is, right? So I want to hear, my question is, I want to hear from you. You've been internationally everywhere. And initially, I assume you lectured in your beautiful South African English, right? And then you went back again to some of these places, and probably unbeknownst to them, you had learned the language to the proficiency that you could lecture. So what was your experience? What was the reaction the first time or the first few times you actually did that and lectured in their native language?
Well, I can tell you that still exists. So I try wherever possible, and I'm able to do this now with Steps to Walk, that when we go and open the program for the week's program, I really try to give a speech in the language of that country, even though that may not be a language that I'm familiar with. I think it's very, very important that in order to communicate and show respect to their culture, who they are, where they're coming from, to share something in common, and language is what brings us all together. It's very, very important. Regardless of whatever language we use to conduct the program, it's still important for them to know that I've taken the time to learn something in their language. So, you know, whether it's in China or Brazil or actually coming up in Pakistan, I'm in the process of learning some Urdu in order to share something with them that's very important. And that communication is part of who I am. And the ability to share that is, as you said, it's out of respect and camaraderie.
And I will tell a quick funny story about that. Before I want Federico to tell us what was the mentor Mark Myerson for him. So I'm not going to let Federico go without this one. But that Dr. Myerson speaking other languages in conference made my life miserable because I'm not as skilled as him. I don't know any other languages. And so I go back to Fellowship, the Latin America meeting, and all my lectures are in English. And there's some technical words that I don't know in Portuguese because I never learned in Portuguese. So I go there and I was hoping that I would do in English because it was an international meeting. And then suddenly Mark Myerson is lecturing in Spanish. How a Brazilian would dare to speak in English? That would be a disaster. So here I went and gave my lecture in Portuguese because otherwise I would sound like an idiot. So thanks for forcing me to do that, Dr. Myerson, putting me back on my spot, on my place. That was a good one. Federico, what was Mark Myerson as a mentor for you? We need to know that.
I needed to thank you about these particular topics because, I think that you taught everybody that it's important to listen everybody and to respect the tradition, to respect the language, and above all, to respect the difficulty that they may have dealing with a different language, dealing with a different country. So you really taught that because maybe Mark Easley don't remember, but I remember one time when I was at our office, and somebody in the audience after my podium presentation asked me a question, and I was not able to reply because I didn't realize the question. And Mark Easley get up and asked like something like, "Do you speak Italian?" No, so that's so he make a joke. I didn't remember the joke, but he was really useful for myself to find the time and to try to find a way to reply to that guy in the audience. So I think that your mission to be.
I remember that. I actually remember that, and what I tried to do in the nicest way was to tell that person to keep quiet, because he didn't know what he was asking. He wasn't able to communicate, and he didn't understand you. So, you need to, I really think we need as leaders and educators, we need to be very respectful of those who come to us, sharing their ideas and work in a language which is not their first language.
Mark, what are you most proud of in your contribution to foot and ankle surgery?
Everything we've spoken about.
Do you have a particular procedure somewhere you feel like you made? I mean, there's so many I can cite many examples, but is there something where you think, wow, that really, I feel like I've made it, and not time to be modest. You've got plenty of things that you can cite, but is there something in particular where you think, well, I think I really pushed the needle forward. I made a big difference here.
Yeah. I think that if you look in the early and mid 1980s, when we look at PCFD in those days, the adult flat foot, what was being done back then was very simply a tendon transfer or transferring the FDL and tying it into the diseased posterior tibial tendon. That didn't make any sense to me. And in 1986, I was operating on an adolescent who had a flat foot. I didn't know terribly much about the pediatric flat foot in those days, so I started reading about it, and I came across the article, which you all know, by Koutsagiannis. And I said, wait a minute. If he can do that, that was published in 1971, if he can do that for feet, because that included adolescents and adults, just with a medial translational osteotomy, why are we not using that to add to the treatment of the flat foot? Because that had not been done anywhere in the world at that time. And of course, the rest is history, because it became the mainstay. And then what developed from that was the scientific basis and the biomechanical rationale for using that osteotomy. But initially, it was simply, it made sense. And it's not that I'm proud of that. No, that's not it. But that was a transitional period where I did influence the way things were done in a significant way. Of course, nowadays there are many, many different ways to address PCFD, but that was important. Recognizing there were many things that I did a little differently, trying things differently. We've already said that, but I don't want to call that, Mark, a sort of a proud moment. I think a very proud moment is that my son's an orthopedic surgeon. He's a resident at Penn, and I'm very proud of him. So there are many other moments, and I think you cannot take one event and say that was apocryphal, because I don't think that's how life is. It's a cumulative experience over the decades.
Good answer.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, we do have to start closing remarks, not completely, but there's one specific topic that we have to cover here, Dr. Myerson, because it's our chance to have it. And it is about foot and ankle clinics. So if you could tell us a little bit how it started, how did you get involved with this? What was your initial drive and your initial goals, and how sometimes we plan stuff and it doesn't go the way we planned initially, but how did you manage to keep the journal on the spotlight for such a long time? You talked a little bit about the articles already. And finally, how was the last 2 or 3 years with you directing the journal, and how did you came about with the idea of changing focus and focusing on different stuff and stepping down from the editorial? So if you could tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So let's put that in the context of what I was doing in terms of editorial responsibilities and work in the 1990s. I had already authored a small textbook. I was a co-editor of another textbook at the time. And I was already now on a role of publishing and doing a lot of new things. But there was not a vehicle for sharing contemporary ideas with your peers who did not have the opportunity to get this information that was collected and synthesized by leaders in the field. And that was my initial motivation for starting foot and ankle clinics. So when I approached the journal, and this was, I think, in 1995, to start foot and ankle clinics, it wasn't very hard to convince the managerial people who were responsible for this to accept this and move forward. As we got started and as I began, of course, I was very naive and inexperienced with putting together a journal of this nature. And over time, I think that my contacts, not only in the US, but internationally, served me very, very well over the decades that I did it. Because it was my responsibility to make sure that leaders in the field were able to share their ideas and guide people who did not have access to this information in one place. And it's very interesting. If you go back over the past few decades and you look at some of the earlier issues on the flat foot or on hallux valgus, at that time, 20 years ago, that was very relevant. We may look at the way things were written back then, the way we illustrated our work, and what was actually written that has evolved so that the next time around, 7 years later, when we did another issue on hallux valgus, there was more to write about. Now, skip forward to some years ago where I realized it was time to move on. I really have always felt that it was very important for me to move aside at some point in everything that I've done and let somebody else take over. And it's not necessarily somebody with that much experience. It's somebody with passion. And that's why I chose you, because you have the passion also as a young educator to pull this together. And others don't necessarily know it, but you also have the international presence and contacts to be able to do that. And I think that's very, very important in a journal of this nature. So it was my time to say that, it had nothing to do with me being tired I don't get tired, and I still have the energy.
That we know. That we all know. That we all know.
The truth.
So, but it's time to hand over the baton, and thank you for taking it on.
No, it's probably the greatest honor of my life, I would say, academic life for sure. So I will leave the last words to Dr. Myerson for sure, but I would like some closing remarks from to Dr. Easley first. Dr. Easley, thank you so much for taking the time for being here. I think you represent a very important past fellow for Dr. Myerson, and I know about your ties with him. So I wanted to have you here, and I appreciate that you took the time. So can you give us some final words before we close the podcast?
Well, it's just extraordinary. Again, it's extraordinary. I think I've said it, and you mentioned it too, but it's just the passion that you are able to further in your, not just people that work directly with you, but in the entire world of foot and ankle. I mean, I think it just shows in everything that you do, and it's inspirational. So I think that was a big message was already delivered. But I've told you this before several times, and you can do it through foot and ankle clinics. You can do it through your textbooks, through your lectures, through a podcast. But I just don't think there's anybody in foot and ankle that has had so much of an influence on just making sure that surgeons are equipped with the best possible knowledge, and then also the enthusiasm to continue to learn more. The ultimate goal is to maximize or optimize patient care. And look what you've done. You've done it where all of the resources are abundant, like in a country like the United States, but you've also taken the steps to walk, and so many other surgeons you've reached that don't have the resources we do, and they're still delivering the best possible patient care and are enthusiastic and passionate about continuing to do that and learn themselves based on you as being their example, not just their mentor, but an example of how, you've said it here, how they can learn more. And then potentially, if they take it on, which they often do, just like the three of us here have, to go and be leaders and then teach others. So it's like it's infectious, right? It's just, there's no way, infectious, I should say. There's really no way that you can deny it, right? It continues to spread, even if you're physically not present there to lead as an example or serve as a mentor. So I thank you. That's what I want to say. It's really a long-winded way to say thank you.
That's great. Federico, same for you. I think you represent such in a great way Dr. Myerson's international outreach, and I know the close ties that you also have with him. So when I thought about this podcast, I had your names as the priority to have here. So we finally were able to do it. So thanks for taking the time and for all the great questions and comments. Closing words for Dr. Myerson and Foot and Ankle Clinics.
I have one thing to tell you and one thing to ask of you. I hope that I have the same passion in 5 years and 10 years. And I ask you to bring me back then to be able to relay that to another generation of foot and ankle surgeons. Thank you.
Of course. We're ready. Let's put on the schedule already, because I know you're going to be more active than you are right now. So we shouldn't be worried about that.
Well, thank
Federico.
you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Cesar, for this opportunity, and thank you, Mark, for the gift to be one of your fellow. Thank you, Mark.
Piacere.
Went same way. Before you should be the closing remarks should be yours, Dr. Myerson.
No, I'm done. I've made my closing remarks already.
Oh no, you have to do it. But I would like to thank you. I think I wrote you a card recently where I just thank you for being who you are and I think I speak on behalf of the international community of foot and ankle surgeons. I have the pleasure to interact with a lot of people that it's like Pelé in soccer. I mean, there's no way to talk about foot and ankle surgery with an international person that they don't mention Dr. Myerson. So thanks for being who you are, and thanks for everything that you did for all of us and for the specialty, and specifically for foot and ankle clinics, that I think it's one of your most important legacy. I know you talked about the flat foot, and I wouldn't go against that at all, but I think foot and ankle clinics is one of the top. If you could list that, at least if I was choosing for you, that shouldn't be that way, but I would say the foot and ankle clinics for sure one of those. Thank you so much for everything that you did and you do, and that you're going to keep doing, and we're all 100% sure that you will.
Thank you. You still want me to say something? I've said it all.
Yeah, you have to say goodbye to all the people that are watching us, because this is going to be the first one.
Whoever watches this podcast, feel free to call me, write to me. I love being involved. I love sharing things. I love sharing ideas and knowledge. And I also like being available to everyone as a mentor, as a friend. I think that's really important. I'm not too fond of the term legacy. Legacy is something that perhaps you leave behind that is memorialized. My legacy really are my friends around the world. That is where I am today and always will be. So, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for our first episode of the Foot and Ankle Clinics podcast. For an exclusive discount on an issue of your choosing, visit us.elsevierhealth.com/expert. Foot and Ankle Clinics is available for individual print subscription with accompanying online access, individual online-only access, as well as on the Elsevier electronic platforms, both Clinical Key and Science Direct. New subscription and single-issue pricing options are also available on the Clinics app. For more information on this series and our nearly 60 other titles spanning all medical disciplines, visit info.theclinics.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to the Foot and Ankle Clinics podcast on Apple Podcasts in the Google Play Store.